Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to Africa This Week with me, Khalil Charles. Our sights are on Ethiopia this week, where there's been a sudden U-turn on the Addis Ababa master plan. Stay with us to find out more about that.
Ethiopia's government has abandoned plans to expand the boundaries of the capital, Addis Ababa, which have caused months of deadly protests. Demonstrations by people from the Oromo ethnic group have been sparked by fears that Oromo farmers could be displaced. Government spokesman Jetta Churida described what was a peaceful demonstration last month escalating into violence and accused protesters of what he called terrorizing the civilians. Human rights groups estimate at least 140 people were killed by security forces during the protests. The ruling party in the Oromia region said it was dropping the plan following discussions with local people.
Now here to give us some reaction to that story on the dispute over Oromia is Mohammed Ademo, who himself is from Oromo and is a journalist on Ethiopian affairs. He's also the editor and the founder of opride.com and is based in New York. Mohammed, thank you very much indeed for joining the program today. Can I ask your personal reaction to the decision by the Ethiopian government to make a U-turn on the master plan?
Thank you so much for having me, Khalil. I think, as you've just indicated, this is a major concession in that the government in power has never actually heeded people's calls and scrapped a plan that it has put forward. But that being said, the concessions come rather a little bit too late, and it is not going to calm the situations in Oromia. Here is why. First, the government has admitted that the people's grievances, including the lack of good governance, the Addis Ababa master plan, and all the other questions people are asking are legitimate. But while admitting the legitimacy of these questions, the government continues to kill students, continues to arrest opposition leaders and activists who are partaking in this protest. So in other words, you scrap the master plan, but you continue with the repression. It seems to just suggest that the government is desperate in trying to contain the protest by proposing to halt the implementation of the master plan. The people are simply not buying it.
So let's try to get some more understanding behind this, because whilst I understand that you're saying that there's still going to be protests and the people aren't happy totally with this U-turn, what have been the factors, though? Can you make that quite clear to us, Mohammed, the factors that have brought about this U-turn on this occasion from the government?
Well, I mean, let's look at the cause of the protest. People started protesting over the Addis Ababa master plan, which, as you've indicated in your report, expands the Addis Ababa's boundaries into the Oromo region. But beyond that, people had questions about the lack of implementation of the constitution, which respects the autonomy of the regional governments. And in the case in Ethiopia for the last 24 years has been that the central government passes down projects and implementation decisions, and the local authorities were just there to implement it. So the government is in a position now where the protests are growing, continuing to expand. It's costing them a lot of money. And they've understood that they cannot put everybody in jail because the protests are so widespread that every town in Oromia has partaken in this movement. So they are in a position where they don't have any other way of containing this other than withdrawing the master plan. But the demands of the protesters go far beyond questions over Addis Ababa's expansion. So I think the government needs to realize that if their questions are legitimate, all the people who have been arrested in connection with this protest this year, in last year's protest, should be released. And that's what the people are asking.
Mohammed, the question is, why now has that been scrapped? Now, I understand these protests, but what I can't seem to understand at the moment, what drove the government behind the idea of trying to, in a sense, cancel the authority or the autonomy that was there for the Oromo region? What was driving the government to try and change the ballgame, if you like?
The government's reason for changing the ballgame with respect to the master plan is because the protests are getting out of control and they have no other way of controlling the public anger that is really outflowing in all corners of the Oromo country. But the government's reason for trying to, for not respecting the autonomy of the regional state in the last 25 years is because the Oromos are the majority in that country. In the government understand that a true democracy, a genuine implementation of the constitution will favor the Oromos group pride. And we are talking about a country that is ruled by a minority government. And it's just always the case that when minorities control the commanding heights of the economy, when the minority governments control a market-dominant economy in the military, they have no option but use the force to suppress and not implement the law. That has been the case in Ethiopia. But again, the government is now realizing that they cannot continue to do that forever. In the concession over the Addis Ababa master plan is just the start. If the government really wants to bring about peace and change in that country, they should implement the constitution, respect the regional autonomy, allow people to elect their leaders. And Ethiopia just had an election in May in which the ruling party won 100% of the vote. But, you know, people feel that they're not represented, and the regional ruling party is just there as a mouthpiece for the federal government. And people want to elect their leaders. People want to have a voice in development projects. And most importantly, they want to feel like they belong and they're not treated like second-class citizens in their own country. So the grievances are long-standing, and I hope that the government will realize the gravity of the situation and the fact that people have had enough, and they're saying enough now, and they will start implementing the constitution, respect people's rights to elect their leaders as provided by the constitution, free all political prisoners, and also allow people to
Mohammed, I wanted to ask you
demonstrate.
about that. Yes, sorry, I'm sorry to cut you. I wanted to ask you about that, the situation of those who've been arrested following the disturbances and following the objection to the government's compliance. What will happen to those people? Will they be released now? And would there be any compensation for the over 100 people that have died in these clashes?
Well, the government's admission that the grievances are legitimate suggests that these people will be released. But the practice in Ethiopia has been that they arrest people, never bring them to court in 48 hours as provided by the constitution. And you know, the government is saying two things, and it's used to using a double speak. So they're saying that the grievances are legitimate, but the protests are infiltrated by anti-peace elements. And what we expect will happen in the next weeks and months is that these people will be charged under the country's sweeping anti-terrorism law for inciting violence. And again, you know, that's essentially why these protests are not going to go away. People have been here before, and they've been cheated before, and they know that the scrapping of the master plan is a lip service. And with all the Oromo leaders and people who are advocating for a nonviolent resistance in that country and using the mechanisms within the constitution to change the status quo in Ethiopia right now, people like Bakala Garba, the deputy chairman of the Oromo Federalist Congress, which is a domestic opposition legally registered. Unless these people are released and allowed to freely exercise their constitutional rights and are brought to court, and essentially the government has no case because by their own admission, their questions, their grievances were legitimate. Unless these things happen, the protests are going to continue, and unfortunately, the security force continue to kill people, and we are in a situation where just after the master plan has been scrapped, about 4 people have been killed in Hararge region in eastern Oromia. In the Ambo University in western Oromia just handed down a threat to the students where they are threatening to arrest everybody or dismiss all the students who participated in the protest. So
Mohammed, I want to cut you there. Sorry, because we're running out of time. But the interesting thing here, Mohammed, is with regard to outside reaction? What has been, if anything, the outside reaction from the international community? What have they said about these protests and about the way the situation has been handled by the Ethiopian government?
The international community is caught off guard. They didn't expect the protest will be this big. And Ethiopia projects this image of stability in the Horn of Africa, but the reality is that those were just a facet. The stability was fake. The U.S. government issued a statement yesterday calling essentially on Ethiopian government to release all people who are arrested and also respect people's rights to protest within the constitutional bounds. And that's a progress because the U.S. government has been quiet on this. The EU has been quiet on the Perth, despite the fact that Oromo people living in Europe have been calling on elected officials there to act. The international community wants a stable Ethiopia, and the current government has been saying that this is a stable country that is growing. But the reality is that the Ethiopian government has been using security forces in the force of the law which it controls, the judiciary which it controls, to suppress people in project a semblance of stability, and that has been shattered to pieces, and the international community will sooner or later have to put more pressure on the Ethiopian government to respect people's rights, because the more repression there is, people are going to turn to other mechanisms of defending themselves, and they know that that is not good for Ethiopia's stability, that's not good for the Horn of Africa region, and it will be devastating for the country.
I want to come back to this question of trust, because you said that the people really don't have much trust and faith that this actual law, which has been, or the plan which has now been repealed, or they've gone back and done a U-turn on it, they don't feel they're actually going to carry that out, and it may be reintroduced. Is that the feeling that people have in the area?
Absolutely. I mean, if you've looked at what the government officials have been saying for the last 9 weeks, they've come close to saying that the master plan will not be implemented if the people reject it. The people's rejection is clear. And at the same time, while the regional officials who just issued this declaration were saying that, the federal authorities, the government communications minister, who you just quoted in your report, Getachew Reda, yesterday told Bloomberg that Addis Ababa development will continue. So in other words, Khalil, the government is giving mixed signals. They are suggesting that the master plan is repealed, at the same time saying that the development will continue, which people would take it as saying the announcement was just a desperate attempt to sort of calm the situation, and the implementation will continue by this or another means. So people have been cheated so many times, and they just don't see anything written on paper. There is no proclamation that was issued. There is no document other than the government statement that suggests that this has actually been repealed. So people are looking for evidence that this is actually repealed and that it will be repealed. And the government giving mixed signals at the state and at the national level only makes those suspicions harder, and it will harden the protest and, as we said, create more instability, more chaos, and unfortunately, more killing.
If putting politics aside, if we can do that for one moment, is there any chance that these new plans by the government, the expansion, if you like, will bring any economic prosperity to the region?
Absolutely not. Here is why. When you bring prosperity, what you need to do is engage in a human-centered development, a development that lifts the poor up, not displace the poor from their farmland and leave them on the street. So what has been happening in Ethiopia is in order to attract foreign direct investment, the government has been giving a lot of land to foreign investors and investors within the country who are interested in developing the land. But the poor people have been given a paltry compensation. Some of them were not even given any compensation, pushed off their land. That's not how you bring prosperity. You don't develop the country by making the poor poor and giving the land and enriching the few people who are connected to the power in the center, and by simply attracting foreign direct investment to put out a number that says that the GDP is growing at 10%. This is not a genuine development, and it is a development that is top-down. What people are asking for is a grassroots-based, a bottom-up, participatory development where people have actually a say in decisions that affect their lives, and they want to benefit from the development that the government is supposedly pushing forward.
Mohammed Ademo, thank you very much indeed for that very insightful commentary about what's happening in Ethiopia and in particular in the Oromo region. Thank you very much indeed. By introducing anti-racist legislation, does this mean that the Rainbow Nation South Africa still has a long way to go in its fights against racism? Or is the interest in this issue a political ploy on the part of the ANC to boost their flagging popularity? We'll be trying to answer that question after the break.